Welcome back to the hashtag IBMI Everywhere show. Thanks so much, Don, for joining us. Today's a little bit of a different experience than you may have seen with the hashtag IBMI Everywhere show. Normally, I have people from outside the rocket world, but I figured today is very important to share and have Don join us today, is because of the fact that he's helped me a lot understanding data in general, and understanding the movement of data from IBMI to pick a cloud, and understanding some of the challenges with it, and kind of the background and the history along with it that Don can certainly share with us today. And hope that that's a good background, and thanks so much, Don, for joining.
My pleasure, Josh. Always a pleasure.
Yeah, and one of the things that I wanted to ask you about is a little bit, how did you get started with data, and like maybe share a little bit of your story, and maybe how you got even to IBMI in general.
Yeah, no worries. So, I mean, it goes back to my days in college. I had every intention of becoming an accountant, and I guess that just wasn't my chosen path, and chose computer science instead. And it's interesting. I've been in the data space for probably 25 years in various capacities, and I think generationally, folks in my generation probably have had a greater exposure to IT perhaps than maybe any have or any will ever. I mean, I went from my first program I punched on a paper tape, and now we're talking about generative AI and quantum computing. I mean, that's a pretty huge span of technologies and things that have happened over the years.
Man, you're not even that old, so that's amazing that you've seen it.
Barely 100. Barely 100.
It is very impressive what you've done, and what are some of the trends you've seen with data? You're starting off on that paper tape, and now we're talking about quantum computing and AI. And where have you seen that shift over the years?
Well, I mean, there's always been a demand for data, right? Even when I first started in IT, I was working with 4GL languages like SAS and Focus, because the end user community was just so hungry to get data, and their frustration with their reliance on, a mainframe COBOL programmer to write them a report, which could take 6 months or 9 months, depending on what their workload was. So, having tools to be able to get that data themselves was critical. And then I think the demands and the parameters around those demands have just changed from I'll do it myself, and if it takes me a week, I'm okay, to today, well, gosh, I can't possibly make a decision with 3-hour-old data. I need 2-minute-old data. So it's demands, it's resources. There's a lot of factors that actually went into that. But it's also been cyclical, because there have been places along the way where, yes, it's important to get that legacy information, but you have to balance that against not only the resources available to provide it, but the resources on the machine itself to provide it. For example, you don't want to have 1,000 users going out there and hammering your IBMI system just so they can write their own reports. So, now the trend is to let's move that data away onto another place where it's not going to impact our production systems.
Wow. And when did that switch change? I mean, I think that what you're talking about is not unique to IBMI, and maybe you could share with a little bit about like some of your experience with like IBM Z as well, and how that all has moved over the years.
Yeah, I think the same technical progression that you see in the data space, you see in other spaces as well. Whenever you put in the word modernization, it has so many different variations to it. I mean, for some people, modernization is to just go to the next version of the software. For some reason, for some people, it's replatforming an entire system, or it's just a better way to do your work with the information that you have. And I think that's probably the place that most people settle, because it's the lowest risk, right? If I can take the data in its original place, I don't have to risk changing it by moving it somewhere else. And when I say moving it somewhere else, I mean in a uncontrolled format, because we haven't really talked about ETL and APIs yet, which help the data movement journey, but just those types of things. And then also, like I said, it's been cyclical over the years. It becomes very important, then it becomes non-important. It's very interesting.
Yeah, and going back to what you said about the replatforming
Yeah.
and or just keeping as is, and having things running at the same, like, and just moving to another platform and like working in tandem. I think that's really relevant. I was looking at some of the IT Jungle articles, and the synopsis and analysis
Mhm.
of the the Fortra IBM trends this year, and I think it's a really an important trend that we're seeing overall is
Yeah.
that people are keeping their legacy applications running on IBM I and IBM Z for that matter, and are
Mhm.
just keeping them where they are, and at the same time though is that they have realized that like let's not re-platform, let's keep the IBM I where it
Yeah.
is, and
Mhm.
but just have that new modern experience because that modern experience is what people are really craving for, but they also don't want to risk destroying what they've built. I mean,
Right.
as you always say that like the legacy systems are good because
Mhm.
of the fact that they work and they're low TCO, as we all know, and that's a really relevant thing you mentioned about replatforming. And that can you go a little bit more about the cyclical part of it? Like you keep on mentioning cyclical.
I think it's just I don't know. I have a hard time explaining the reason why, and I don't know if anybody's actually went and back and kind of looked at the trends, but it just seems like and maybe it's the economy, maybe it's distractions, maybe it's some of the realizations that you have with you mentioned migration, right? Migration was a great idea. Unfortunately, the place you were moving it to didn't have the same capabilities you were moving it from. Maybe those are some of the same reasons you see in the data modernization journey where it's a great idea and everybody kind of jumps on the bandwagon, but then the realization kicks in that maybe with the technologies that we have today, it's not working as well as it should. So it kind of goes down to a simmer, and then there's a new technical revolution, new ideas, new software, new ways of doing things, and then it just piques the interest again. And I've seen that over the last 25 years, actually.
Oh, interesting. And when you're talking about like some of the challenges in the space of
Mhm.
moving data, like would you mind sharing like what have you seen in your 25 years of experience in?
Yeah, absolutely. One of probably the biggest challenge with data of some of these legacy systems is you have to keep in mind that when they were created 50 years ago, things like memory was at a premium. So data needed to be codified to save on storage, right? So you probably have, mainframe data files that are less than a couple of pictures on your cell phone right now because they were able to crush everything down and make it really, really efficient. That's great, but that doesn't translate into a new data format. I mean, sure, I can move an X from one platform to the other, but without the business logic from the programs and the applications, I don't really know what that X means because it's not a text X, it's an X that signifies, you know, a function, a department, some other thing that's associated with that data, and you need the business logic to kind of unwind that.
So you're saying that when if you'd send out that information from, let's say,
Hmm.
your IBMI or IBM Z,
Yeah.
because of the way it's compacted, it would just basically turn to this gobbledygook in like in your Snowflake environment.
Well, data is data, right? I can move a data string and put it over there, and it's going to be exactly the way it was in its original form, but it doesn't have any context, is I guess what I'm saying. So you put it into any relational format in the cloud on-prem, it's still just a series of characters that you think about a part number, for example, is a great example. A part number may have a 3-digit prefix on the part number, and the first digit might be the country code, the second might be the warehouse code, and the third might be government, non-government, just for the sake of an example. Well, if you're just looking at ABC, you have no idea what's the difference between an ABC and a DBC, right?
No, that makes total sense. That would make. I mean, they're all code words, so you need to find
Yeah.
out what those things are and understand why what really is the information behind it to be able to utilize that information. And so I guess then a question for you is with when we talk about like the change in the amount of data, like when did that
Mhm.
change? Like when did data become or when did storage become so cheap that these problems don't exist?
I don't know. I think some of the problems still exist, right? You still have a 50 or 60-year-old, COBOL or RPG system running. It's just that now I've got, X number of customers that I had, 25 years ago. So I've got a 10X change in my data volume, right? The applications haven't changed. I think there's a lot of data around the legacy system that's absolutely exploded. I mean, unstructured data is something that is huge in every organization, right? Anything from, for example, you now go into Home Depot, for example, and you're at the checkout register and you scan an item, and not only does it show you a description and the price, but it shows you a picture of what you just bought right on the screen. Well, that data has to be stored somewhere. Now, it's not in the legacy system per se, but there may be a link in the legacy system that hooks that picture together with the back-end systems.
Love that. That's really relevant because I think that as we're going to the new stage and new data, the age of new data, like having the recognition that everything's interconnected and everything's interwoven, and there's so many things that you require that to be connected with each other. And I have another question for you: is do you have any good stories from like your experience in the IBM I or IBM Z?
Pertaining to what? I mean, I've done pre-sales for the last 25 years, and I think every salesman has a whole toolbox full of stories, right? I've got a lot of them. Just throw me a bone here and let me see if I can.
Well, that's a good bone. Well, maybe you could share how you switched from, or what your experience has been from moving from IBM Z over to IBM I.
I mean, it's been an interesting, transition. So it's certainly a platform that has, I liken it to, the VSE platform in relation to the IBM Z. Right? There's a lot more of them. In some situations, they're much smaller than your traditional Z system, right? Mm-hmm. But that doesn't mean you couldn't have an organization that has hundreds of IBM I machines. I remember my first IBM I client, it was probably back in 1992-ish. It was up in Ohio, the birthplace of both Josh and I. Literally, it was a retail chain, and they had an IBM I in every one of their retail locations. And I remember the CIO telling us that we actually get IBM I's, it was AS400s back in that day, delivered by the semi-truckload. And they would bring them in. They had a whole team that would reconfigure them. They'd slap them back on the semi and take them out to all the stores. And they were satellite linked together so they could bring everything together at the home office. So that's probably my most interesting IBM I.
Well, Don, one thing I'm going to share with you that's going to be a little scary. We're going to put on our sales caps. Watch out, guys.
Okay.
One of the things that I find a lot of times in the IBM I space is that people are looking to move data, as Don mentioned earlier, and they are trying with like traditional ETL tools or CDC tools, and they are struggling to move it. And they also are looking at other tools like APIs and trying to figure out how to mesh both them together. And maybe, Don, you mind giving like a really maybe a high level of like when do you use APIs and when do you use ETLs, and maybe the pros and cons of those two?
Sure. I mean, there's a lot of factors that go into that ATL, API, CDC decision. Probably the biggest one is the acceptable latency of your data. One of the challenges that we find with APIs is you've got immediate access to the data, except APIs are good for getting a couple of records, but you certainly wouldn't want to probably use APIs to analyze 10 million records worth of data, because you're having to call that program a lot of times to get through that data. ETLs, on the other hand, do a great job of taking the data and moving it from platform to platform and then applying some transformation rules in the middle to undo some of that stuff we talked about before with the product code, warehouse code, all those types of things. But you typically always have a latency issue with ETLs because you're only going to run them every week or every couple days, or maybe even every 24 hours. And really, depending on the speed of your business, 24-hour data may not be good enough. Probably the best compromise in that is change data capture, CDC, where you bulk load everything in one lot to get it from platform to platform. It has the same capabilities of applying transformation rules and things like that. And then you set up an agent that says, every time my legacy source system change, I want to replicate that immediately out to my target system. So it's kind of the best of both worlds. You get all the transformation capabilities and the business logic from an API. You get the bulk capabilities that you would get from an ETL, but you've lowered that latency down to near real time because you're constantly monitoring for any changes and bringing that back to your source systems. And then just to add one, I guess, cherry on the top of is that if you happen to be moving something away, you have the ability to use bidirectional change data capture, which means I can split my system apart and keep two different systems in sync at the same time.
Very interesting. Don, we're going to take off our hats, our sales cap. Watch out.
Okay.
It's
Okay.
off. Don, I really appreciate your time. I think that if you guys have any questions and about data and trends, or just want to learn more about where we could help out with data, you know where to find me, and I certainly can help you out with connecting with Don. Really appreciate you, Don, for joining, and looking forward to having you on some other time. Talk to y'all soon. Thanks so much.